Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. I am Mario Veen, and this is episode 48, Everyday Activism with Chris Julien.
Strange shadows on the wall. Reality is not so real at all. Philosophy invites you to be brave. Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave.
Today I speak with Chris Julien, who you might remember from episode 26. He wrote a book called Everyday Activism, or Alledaags Activisme in Dutch. Chris is an activist and researcher, and he's a PhD candidate at Utrecht University, where he works on ecological governance with an emphasis on new materialisms and decolonial ecology. He has an independent practice at the intersection of ecology and culture, and he's a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion in the Netherlands. Do you remember Melisandre of Assay from Game of Thrones? Carice van Houten is the Dutch actress who played her, and nowadays you can find her at climate protests with the picket sign that says "The night is dark and full of fossil fuels." She wrote the preface to Chris's book, in which she describes how he was pivotal in her becoming an activist. She writes, "On February 13, 2023, I was finally awakened by the calm, scientific, yet terrifying words of Chris Julien." I really like the title of this book, Everyday Activism. Activism can take many forms, and although peaceful civil disobedience activism like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil is crucial, the way to systems change is if all of us, or at least a large percentage of us, looks for opportunities to do activism in our everyday lives. So far the book is only available in Dutch, but I hope there will be an English translation, and I will discuss it in my English series of book reviews called Challenging Time. In that series I want to discuss some Dutch books which really should be translated, and this is one of them. By the way, you can now read the first installment in that series and see the description for the link. Enjoy my conversation with Chris.
Physics, so poetry and art, interdisciplinary start. We will travel, but you're safe. Welcome to Life from Plato's Cave.
Welcome back in Plato's Cave.
Thanks, Mario.
Last time we spoke, it was December 2022. That was a really nice conversation. It was episode 26. And I've been talking to some more people for the second or the third time. So one question I always like to ask, because you're very involved in climate activism, is now we're about a year and a half into the future. Are you more hopeful, less hopeful, about the same?
So there's the thing that I don't really like to do, hope. So I immediately respond with a slightly complex answer. For me, hope is kind of like the last thing you've got left, right? After all your agency and all your capacity to actually influence the situation is gone, then the last thing you can do is hope. So I can hope for my neighbors' quick recovery when I hear they're ill, but if their doctor tells them, I hope that you will get well, that's not something you want to hear from your doctor, right? Because they can do something about it. If they're a good doctor. So I'm not necessarily more or less hopeful, but I do think things have become a bit clearer in the last 18 months. And I think for a lot of people, it's become also clearer what they can do and what needs to be done. So in that sense, if I need to kind of translate that, then I would be more hopeful about people's capacity now to respond well. I think there's a broader sense that action needs to be taken now on the climate crisis. But of course, that's also proportionate to the climate chaos that we've seen in the past 18 months and the fact that things are really accelerating. So again, that to me shows why hope is a bit of a weird concept, because yeah, okay, it's very mixed bag, but I do think there's more energy now than the last time we spoke.
And hope suggests maybe also that that you have a clear goal in mind about this is where we should end up by this time. Do you have that, or is it just do what you can?
Yeah, I think exactly. So hope, like, yeah, what hope kind of suggests a finish, also something to like an end result, or like a final state or some resolution. And of course, climate crisis, collapse of the climate and ecosystems that we as a species also grew up in, that's not really gonna end or stabilize in the coming generations. So I don't think necessarily we can kind of like speak in these terms of targets. And I think it's more about, to me at least, to find a way to create a sense of agency and meaningfulness in your own life, and understand how you can be a part of the world that we live in, and that we haven't chosen or picked from a menu of worlds that we would prefer. We're stuck in the world as it is, and we can respond to that in meaningful ways. So I think for me, it's about discovering a way to live meaningfully in a time of crisis.
Yeah, this discussion about hope. Well, actually, I of course, you are also a kind of scientist, but more like a social scientist, humanities scientist, right? But it's a question I also like to ask to the beta scientists, because they can answer this question more in terms of the measurable things that they can hold on to, and what needs to be done. But it also reminds me of something you wrote in your book. Yeah, and that made me think about sad planets, about the whole discussion about climate and emotion. You wrote something about, there's, especially in the Netherlands, I don't know if it's in other countries as well, there's this whole discussion about should we be positive or negative. And there's this Dutch guy who wrote this book, The Climate Optimist. And there's this whole discourse about we should stay optimistic, because if we're not optimistic, then people won't act. And I think you write something that it's a Dutch expression, like putting the horse behind the carriage. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So of course you can ask people, do you have a sense of optimism towards a situation, and also towards a situation like climate crisis? And yeah, the one day I might feel more optimistic than the other day, and some days I might feel quite pessimistic, or on the topic of global planetary tipping points, I might be very pessimistic, but then on the capacity of people to respond, I might be by and large optimistic. But I think talking in terms of our emotional perspective towards the situation and kind of prioritizing that can also be a form of like emotional evasion, right? It can be a defense mechanism to not have to really face the facts just as stark realities, right? That the beta scientist can also kind of attest to. Like, you cannot kind of, your mood doesn't really influence the physical atmosphere. It might influence the atmosphere in the room among people, but being an optimist or a pessimist permanently, I think, is not very healthy mental state. But moreover, it kind of shifts the discussion away from like, hey, what's really happening? And I think it's also kind of a safe space then to talk about, oh, are you optimistic or pessimistic? It gives a sense of control in terms of, at least I can control my attitude, and somehow that will then shape my perspective on the world, irrespective of what the facts are actually telling us is going on. So yeah, I sense often that, especially in the media, moving the discussion quite quickly either into solutions or into attitudes probably is also a defense mechanism, not to actually have to face the facts and kind of like really confront, the beast of climate chaos and the futures that portends.
Do you know, I have it here, this book, The Language of Climate Politics?
I saw it passing by on Twitter when I still took a look there once in a while, but I haven't really looked into it.
It's really good, by Genevieve Gunther. It's called The Language of Climate Politics, Fossil Fuel Propaganda and How to Fight It. She talks about different kind of groups, which I always like because it makes it simple. So you have the techno-optimists who say technology is going to solve it, the eco-modernists. and different groups, but she also mentions the doomsters.
Yeah.
But what was novel for me, at least, I had a sense there are different kinds of doomsters, but it's really nice when someone verbalizes it. She said there's the type of doomster that kind of overstates the science, because they say, well, it's too late already, we've passed tipping points already. But then a second group that she names are more the young people that are more like political doomsters, that are saying, yes, we do have all the technology, we have all the knowledge, we even have all the legal and political possibilities, but we're pessimistic about whether the adults are actually going to do something before it's too late. And by the time that we as a young generation, when they retire and we get to take over the wheel, it will be too late already to do something.
It's like 2040 by then.
Yeah. So, and I think I start to recognize that more and more also in teaching I do, where I used to ask this question, okay, who is cynical about that this is going to change? And then I used to say, well, actually that's kind of a form of science denial, because the science says that it's never too late to prevent wars. Of course, it's too late already, right? We're clear about that, but we can always do something. But lately there's people that say, yeah, okay, I know that, but I don't think people are going to change. I don't think the world is going to change.
Well, that's of course, it's a big part of the debate now. These kinds of, but they're binaries, right? That's my problem with these and I don't want to gaslight the kids. So I think they're very much entitled to their perspectives. But for me, this idea of being too late or not too late, people going to get into action or not, there are all these kind of binaries, but the future isn't given, right? The future is like a spread of statistical probabilities. All these different things can happen, and it's really, if you look at complex systems, especially adaptive systems like ecosystems or societies, there are quite small elements that can shift, that can cause quite big changes to occur. And so the probable outcomes that we are looking at, from the really business as usual that makes it super bad quite quickly, and things starting to move maybe in surprising ways, I don't think you can really predict the future, especially not in these like binary outcomes. It's kind of like a novel might end with this super clear moral, but we'll probably end up messy somewhere in the middle, and we might have some surprising results in the meantime. So I guess I understand that critique of doomerism as this kind of foreclosure of possibility, like, oh, somehow I have a privileged view of the whole situation and I can see with absolute certainty how it's going to go. But that's, of course, also a form of false certainty in the end, right? It can be comforting to be able to give up. And this habit of having a life of certainty, I guess that's for sure, that's over. So the uncertainty, I also write about that a lot, try to make it in an everyday way, because of course the book tries to speak to the everyday, but also bring sort of philosophical insights into that. And I think one of the key shifts to my mind that we're going through is from a world where we have this partially true and partially fictitious notion of certainty and control. We can map out the world, we can create all these technologies that control all these outcomes and systems. But then in the end, what we see now is there's always all these unintended consequences, and we don't have that control. We don't even have the capacity to say it's too late. We don't even have that kind of control. So I guess, to me, that means that we cannot do otherwise but just go on and try, and then, be open to be surprised. But I guess I wouldn't necessarily say that against or in a counter argument to these kids, but in a conversation like that, I would try to open up the fact that there are these many possible futures still. And I guess the whole scope of them isn't getting better. So the bandwidth of possible futures isn't moving in a positive direction. but it isn't becoming more singular either. So that the kind of doomster that wants certainty, yeah, I can see that there's a critique of that, but then the people like me who argue that embracing also the possibility of catastrophe, of really bad outcomes, is a very important part of a reckoning with all these possibilities of the present and understanding the terrible pressures and risks that we're facing. So I think that, yeah, the doomster narrative needs a lot of nuancing and in different ways to different people.
No, I think it's also that many people feel powerless because they say, well, okay, we realize that we need system change, but I'm an individual. You talk about this in the book a lot. So it's not just about the question, how can I as an individual change the system? But you're saying actually this notion that these are separate things that's the problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's this old song that we've heard so many times, that there's the individual and the system, there's the micro level, there's microeconomics, and then there's the macro level, there's macroeconomics, and there's no actual causal relation, direct relation between these two. So the individual, you can say with certainty stuff, and then the big level you can kind of only say statistical stuff about. And that's kind of a powerless position to be in. I've always had this with voting. It feels weird because if you vote for a national election and political election, then yeah, what my vote doesn't actually influence the election in any in any proper way. I can't see the effects of what I do. So it's kind of a symbolic act, even though it adds up. And I guess it's kind of the same with like starting your engine of your gasoline car in the morning and thinking like, yeah, I don't know how this adds up to a systemic global phenomenon. And so it's really hard to understand that gap and how to bridge it. And I guess a lot of the book was trying in a very sort of materialistic way, in a very trying to use science, what we know, to argue exactly how these kind of leaps happen from smaller scale systems into larger scale systems, and what kind of leverage points then we have, to create change in bigger systems from these relatively powerless, relatively small positions that we all feel we are in. Even a lot of relatively influential people, like, for example, journalists, will often say like, what difference do I'm tiny old me make in the order of things? But yeah, if you look at social tipping points now, the science coming out on those in the last years, kind of based on the idea of planetary tipping points and this idea that systems don't shift once all the elements in the system have changed, but that you actually often see that relatively small parts of the system, once they start to shift, the whole system can at some point tip into a different state, because the systems aren't mechanical, but they have all these feedback mechanisms that can reinforce themselves and become stronger and stronger. And so I guess one of the core points of the book is to kind of show how social systems, change of norms within groups and within societies, is always a question of kind of the first people starting to move, and then a group of people kind of recognizing a shifting trend and following that. And then actually you don't need to shift everyone's opinion before the whole system shifts, but you only need like 15, 25, 40%. It kind of depends on what the system is and how much resistance there is. But there's all this space in these complex systems to have these quite fast and accelerating mechanisms that allow you with a small group to actually influence the bigger part. But in the past, I guess we often were surprised by these and then said like, oh, it's kind of, inexplicably things can change. And then we have these kind of platitudes to describe that. But now the science is kind of catching up and able to kind of, in a more dry-eyed and descriptive way, show what's actually going on when suddenly everybody's wearing a different kind of fashion, or like a revolution hits, like what's the mechanisms involved there? And I think, we can all make use of those.
Yeah, I'm working on this book about philosophy of time and climate change. And I'm reading also, I'm going to interview Emily Herring, who wrote actually the first biography of Henri Bergson. I didn't know there wasn't a biography about him. That's one of the fundamental insights that I try to connect to climate activism as well, is that we look at time like the Marvel movies, like there are different futures, and what we do we have these possible futures, and what we do now which decides which timeline we're going to follow. But Bergson, and I probably don't say it properly, I need to study it more, he says, well, this possibility is actually only something we can say afterwards. And we don't know, right now, we don't know what will turn out to be the decisive action. Because when you speak about tipping points, we speak about climate tipping points, but you also speak about social tipping points. And we don't really know what is the thing that's going to set it off, right? I mean, we just have an example, and you have, maybe it's nice to also go over one of the examples of your book, but Greta Thunberg, I think, is a great example because the whole world knows her. But what did she do? She just started out sitting striking, on a strike from school.
Yeah.
And it could be, maybe one news item. Oh, yeah, this girl from Sweden doesn't want to go to school because of climate change. Okay, you read about it, you have a feeling, and that's it. But she's the most important climate activist. But why? And maybe now we can look back and say, well, maybe this was the reason why. But I think at the moment that she decided, okay, this is it. This is what I'm going to do now. I mean, it's a very nice way of activism.
Yeah.
Just going to sit here and talk to people if they want to talk to me. But we can look back and, of course, project all these things, but I don't think it was just the right thing for her to do at the moment.
Yeah.
And she was persistent.
Exactly. I think it's so interesting, right? You can get so philosophical about this idea of the arrow of time, and we're in the flow of time, and how does that play out with these, because maybe 20 years ago, the time flow you were in was kind of your career and maybe your parents and your kids, but was still quite and then outside of your time flow, maybe the world was going on with wars abroad or geopolitical things. But now actually we're in this flow where like planetary tipping points are potentially part of our lives. So our sense of the world that we are in is also in a way expanding. But then still the most historic, one of these very historic events in that respect is this teenager sitting in front of a Swedish parliament one day. And it also shows, I guess, that you can't capture that in a percentage, right? So the social tipping points, some studies then show like I need approximately 25% of a group to really strongly feel about a new norm and start acting in a new way. And then the rest of the group will follow because they're either thinking, here's an interesting new thing, I would like to participate in that. And at some point even saying like, if I don't join, I'll be left out. So maybe first it's a kind of a push, and at some point it becomes a pull, or the other way around. In any case, there's different motivations in those phases that the system flips and that a group starts to have like a new perspective and a new norm. But then this one Swedish kid, neurodivergent, very honest, very clear spoken, manages to cut through all of that and kind of create this huge shift from this really tiny point. And that's, I think, why I like this idea of the of leverage, of a lever simply.
Yeah, the lever. And of course, people can get inspired by Greta, and now everybody can join Extinction Rebellion.
14th of September is a big one on the 8/12.
14th of September, yeah. So then you're already in a group, but you're doing something which is not allowed, which is blocking a road. So that's kind of in the middle. You're not just on your own, but you're with a group, and you can support each other, right? That's really great.
I think the toughest thing is the first person. That's also what these kinds of social studies about social tipping points show. Like, nobody wants to be on their own with a different opinion from the rest of the group. That's, I think, also one of the biggest blockades to climate activism is you feel you step out of the group, and that's just something we are not as social animals really intuitively inclined to do. But once the first person joins, it becomes already much easier to hold that position. So yeah, being then on the streets with all these people that have that same position is really a big relief, because you don't feel like this one odd person in the room complaining that everybody's still flying or something. You're actually among all these people, which is a really big relief. But that's also, I think, then something you can bring into other kind of everyday situations. That sense of like, yeah, I'm not like this like crazy person with this fringe opinion. It's actually a very well-founded opinion, and there's lots of people that support me. And that gives you, I think, also a certain type of courage that you can carry into maybe your workplace or other situations where also change is needed. So yeah, you can carry your lever around also perhaps, and kind of find different stable points to give it a push. But yeah, I guess for me, Greta also shows, that's being so steady in that, being very clear and simple and dedicated, being very solid. Archimedes, this Greek mathematician, said like, yeah, give me a stable point and a lever long enough, and I will move the world. And I put that quote in my introduction because I really like this idea that if you have a stable point, yeah, then you can start to move big things. As activist, I think you are that stable point also in a group to shift the opinion of the group. I'm a bit of a visual thinker, so I can also really kind of imagine this situation, right? Where you kind of feel in your body you're a leverage point, and then the rest of the group at some point will flip over into a different kind of mindset if you just have the patience and the resolve to stay at it.
Often you don't really even have to do something, but just stay there and not move or
not
just,
give up.
persist. So you're active for Extinction Rebellion since 2019?
It's my 5-year anniversary.
Yeah, but congratulations. But your book is actually not really about that. I mean, you don't talk about it a lot. You say one time that it's more like the tip of the iceberg of activism. So let's talk about this whole part below the water, which is everyday activism. So it's for people who, of course, people who want to join Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil or something like great. But there's also a lot of people that think, well, this is too radical. And everyday activism might be more for them.
Yeah, so I just to kind of like give it a little walk into that. It's like, you do the street stuff and you feel so purposeful about it. And it really opens up also the space to feel the urgency and to see what's proportionate and what we need to do. And then your friends and your surroundings, a lot of people, they get it and they kind of respect it, but they're not going to do it. So even in my own bubble, so to speak, so many people, it's not for them somehow, or it's too scary or too different from their normal lives to consider. So, however important it is to go onto the streets, and I use also a couple of examples from like real, like sort of street activism and Just Stop Oil throwing soup on paintings and stuff, because it's really a nice example of the type of thing we need to do. But it isn't realistic, I think, to expect everyone to be doing that. And even if everyone was doing that, it would be kind of weird, because then all the systems need to change, right? Like all the workplaces, all the types of situations we are in everyday life, they all need to shift in different ways, away from fossil fuel, away from ecocidal ways of producing. So that's kind of everywhere. So we also need everyone in the places where they're already at to start making system change, and to start kind of like sitting down halfway through a meeting and saying like, wait a minute, I don't think this is the direction we should be taking, and really trying to explain to their environment the urgency of the situation, and trying to connect that urgency to these everyday situations that we're in at the school of our kids, or like at our congregation where we pray. There's all these different places that we're part of the system. And so for me, that's, I think, a very, optimistic, or not optimistic, but positive fact that we are part of all these systems, and that's why we can change them. That's why we can grab hold of them, not because we're outside of them, judging them ethically, for example, but because we're actually in them. We can grab them. That's, I think, the premise of everyday activism, is that everyone has climate leadership once they start to look around in their own lives and all the connections that they already have and all the things they already do, and start to figure out where they can really shift something in that system. And then you'll see that actually these kinds of shifts can really have knock-on effects onto bigger systems, right? The scientists talk about cascading effects. So yeah, once one system starts to shift, it's connected to all this other stuff. So once you start to shift maybe one type of behavior with your colleagues, maybe everybody sees like, oh, this wasn't as bad as we thought, and there may be some enthusiasm starts to emerge. Really hearing the honest urgency of the situation from somebody you already know and trust is, of course, a much more convincing story than hearing somebody you don't know on the street blocking the traffic and telling you it has to change. So I think it's really like a complementary, additional idea that it's really important to be on the streets, be in public space, make a really clear message. But then when you go home, or other people who are still at home, it's equally important to start to mobilize change there. And that's not only for people who are like high potential executives or working in offices or theoretically educated. I think everybody has these ties. So that's also a really, I think, yeah, fits my ethic. And I think it's important also to talk about it in a way that is available to everyone, without having to step out of the stuff they're already doing and all the obligations they have in their lives, but to use all that stuff that you already do and have as a lever again, you know, as an attachment you can use for change.
Does it mean that, so everyday activism, that you look at your everyday life? Where do I live? Where do I work? Which people I see? And then look what possibilities for activism are there. Is that too simple, or?
I think that's the core of it. So yeah, we have all these connections, not only as consumers, as some would have us believe, right? But we have all these connections as parents, as workers, or bosses, or as religious people. And I think that the power of that is that you have a common ground, which is real and everyday with all these ties that you have. You know people, you have these shared concerns together for your kids at school. Or, you know, like maybe an example we can talk about later, if you're all a civil servant in a municipality, you all made an oath to uphold the safety of the city and its inhabitants. So I think that's super powerful, all this specific kinds of concerns and kinds of connections and ties that you have in your life, that you can kind of link to this big issue and kind of scale down together with people in your surroundings. What does that mean for us? Like, how does that connect to the things we are already concerned about, and activate that? Because I think then you can really activate intrinsic motivation in groups, instead of going into say like oppositional debates or yes no kind of things, but really find out like where are we all concerned about the future together, and can we mobilize that concern and that positive energy in the sense of being caring together? Can we mobilize that into something that then is activistic in the sense that you try to change systems that need to change?
Yeah, I like you write, action starts with letting go of the idea that someone else will solve it.
Yeah.
That's nice. But yeah, let's maybe go through some examples, because to make it a little bit more concrete.
Yeah, so maybe to go on with the one I was just alluding to. I really like that, how this happened, also because it shows that like you don't have to change your job. You don't have to like really have this hallelujah moment and do everything differently. You can also kind of tactically, in a kind of smaller way, just look sharply at what's going on in your life and see where you can kind of like, yeah, grab hold of something to shift. And then, so these Amsterdam civil servants in the municipality, I think they did it really well by writing a letter, like a kind of an emergency letter, saying, as I said just now, like we all swore this oath. We are all committed to the safety of the city and the health of its inhabitants. But then if we look at the policy of our city towards climate change and ecological destruction, there's a huge gap between the facts and our policy. And the letter ended kind of with this question, how are we going to close this gap? And this is a group of 6 or 8 or 10 people who wrote this letter together and talked about it and shared the concerns. And then they just, in a slightly disobedient way, they sent it to 18,000 of their colleagues on the general mailing list, which is usually kind of not allowed, like, to do without approval. And this kind of opened up a lot of energy in the municipality. So a lot of people, a lot of civil servants signed this letter. They were like, yeah, we need to close that gap between the urgency and what it asks of us and what we're already doing. And they got into a conversation with the management team of the municipality and kind of into a negotiation of how can we get this urgency, how can we make it practical? And I really like the proposal that the municipality they said, like, hey, what if we give everyone 10% of their work time they can dedicate within their work to climate change? So everybody can kind of reorient like a couple of hours a week from what they were already doing into this question. But sadly, the council, the city council, voted that down. But then what had already happened was that because this conversation had started, and I think they started the conversation in a way that made sense to all these colleagues and to this community together as a group of what they should be doing. It made sense to a lot of people. So a lot of energy was kind of unleashed by bringing this clear and honest story out there and giving people also a sense of group responsibility. And then in a year, the sort of the organism of the municipality, without that these letter writers really did that much beyond the writing of the letter, set up a number of working groups and this kind of open workshop where everybody could come with ideas and problems to kind of exchange through all the departments, very interdisciplinary way. And then in the first year now, they managed to get a reduction percentage for 2030. So how much will Amsterdam have reduced emissions by 2030, up from 42 to 46 or even 8%. So kind of a significant shift, if you consider that that's one letter written, tapping into energy that was probably already there, of course. And that process is still ongoing. So that energy is not like linear, goes to one endpoint and then stops, right? It's just kind of finding its way through all these people that are also discovering new ways then to act and to put into place new policies and measures. So I really like, it's kind of like Greta. It's kind of like a small thing can start, but then it can really create a bigger shift.
What I like about it too is Greta was speaking a lot from her identity as, how do you say that, a school child?
Mm.
And she said, okay, what's the use in going to school if there's no future?
Yeah.
And in this case, I like this question, how are we going to close this gap? Because they're not saying we have this, personal standpoint and we want the whole organization to do that. They're saying, so this is what we say that we're going to do as an organization or as an institution. And look here, we can show that we're not doing it. There's a gap. And so kind of saying, well, this is my professional responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. And that as we're talking now, I'm thinking like also that it's not so much, of course, there's a moral component to all this, but it's not primarily a moral take that they're giving, right? It's kind of like more, in a sense, more pragmatic than that, or more communal. That is kind of I think Greta's question is also kind of a practical question in a way. It's like, this doesn't make any sense in a very simple way. You don't have to be like very liberal or very socialist or very religious or atheistic to have an opinion about that, right? It's kind of a common sense standpoint for every school kid, and every parent can relate to that more or less from the facts. So I really like that too, that it's not being per se preaching, but it's kind of using a level of common sense that's part of a community. So common in the sense of being part of a community or a group of people, and appealing to that rather than being this individual sense of moral outrage and then sort of kind of like berating people that they're doing wrong and they need to change. It's kind of giving a challenge to a group. So I guess there's a degree of pragmatism there that can also unify people more easily, bring people together, because there's not per se.
You're just not really disrupting in a way that XR protests would disrupt something.
Yeah, well, maybe a bit more or less. I mean, less probably, but you're still disrupting, I think. You're still disrupting, but in a way that fits the community you're part of and isn't just coming in like a meteorite from somewhere far away and then just kind of like blowing shit up. It's a bit more proportionate to the situation. And it's really it's practical in the sense of like we need to get shit done. We need to get to work together. And we need to make a move. And I guess that's a difference from like protest activism, where you're really trying to put something on the agenda and demand something from others. Here you're actually doing it together, right? You're not saying the state should change. You're saying like we're going to change together how we can change. So I think it has more to do with practical agency there. And I really like also this other example. I haven't met these people yet. I hope to once the book is released in the south of the Netherlands, where they started to create like a sustainable sports club. So they were redoing the sports club, and they said, let's make it completely energy neutral and make it super nice, 21st century, sort of solar paneled, bio-isolated, all the stuff you can imagine on a technical level that you want. But also quickly realizing it's not only about the infrastructure and the real estate, it's very much about behavior and about attitudes and perspectives. You know, maybe we don't need to keep the beer cooling on 24/7, but kind of more around the time that people actually drink a beer at a sports club at the end of the afternoon.
But then what's the difference to try to distinguish it a little bit more? There's and like there's this commercial, or what is it called? This campaign in the Netherlands, which is saying, "Oh, everybody is doing something. Everybody is doing something. We all know about this climate change. I'm showering shorter, and this person is having solar panels, and this person is recycling, and this person is biking instead of taking the car." So what's the difference between what you're proposing and what many people are doing? Like, oh, I try to fly less, I try to maybe become vegetarian. And then but it's like, okay, I do everything what I can do as an individual and try to reduce my footprint because...
Exactly. And this goes back to what we were talking about before, Mario, with the idea of like the individual and the system, right? We're so hardwired to think about, I can do my individual thing, and then like more well-off people will say that they have electric car and they have the solar panels, like they have the whole personal suite of green like innovations and green changes in their life. Full stop, right? I did my bit. But I think like, well, first of all, it's a very consumption-oriented way of looking at yourself and your life, and it's very much about the footprint and not about the handshake, you know, not about the social element, but more importantly, I think we can aspire to more than that, because we can aspire to go beyond this private domain and this small household notion of agency that we usually have. But we don't need to immediately hop to the state level to like, okay, then the other thing is like a national level or even like global level. But there's more like this meso level. There's all these bits in between that are all systemic and that are all structural and that can all like make changes that are far beyond our individual capacity for impact as a like small household economic unit. So I think like doing your whole sports club net zero is great, but the example here is much more interesting because it actually becomes like a community attractor. It becomes a magnet for the whole community to have this conversation about what can we do as a community together to make a difference. And that kind of slides laterally into doing during COVID food gardens together, which at some point like produced 25% of all the fruit and veg for the community. Into hosting all these other kinds of community associations there. So on the one hand, you can kind of scale sideways. You can spread into other things, I think, with your work. You can spread into, you know, like the surroundings of your own house. You can set up a neighborhood association to make change, but you can also move upwards in structures. to move for the whole club, or maybe for like, okay, for all soccer fans, and you got your club to be like green. Okay, maybe talk to all the other soccer clubs in the area, right? There's not necessarily, I think, an end point to system change. And if you feel responsible a bit for the world, and you understand the stakes that we're facing now, I think it's kind of like doesn't make sense to stop where you as a consumer have, if you are very kind of well off, able to change all the things within your consumer pattern, and then say, this is it, this is my life, this is my impact and influence in the world, and now I can kind of like sit down in my net zero house and watch Netflix again. I think it's kind of this idea that you reach beyond your personal sphere, and that's different for everyone. And some people may be able to reach further at first, others may be able to make more deep change. But I think it's all about understanding that you're part of all these structures that are bigger than your household, that are part of society. What Hannah Arendt, as this mid-20th century famous philosopher, says, like the vita activa, the active life, is in collaboration with other people, is where you show yourself in the public realm as somebody who takes initiative and takes action. And so I think it's really about stepping into the public realm out of the private, making conversations there with your environment, and making system change that isn't immediately like the COP29, but it's also not just about solar panels on your roof. So it's really this meso level.
I like this example of the park in your neighborhood, or what was it, like a roundabout? Can you tell that story? I think that was you,
well,
right?
Yeah, and that's of course, it's not, again, not a binary between like system and individual, and I think this speaks to that. But like I decided at some point I want to make the park near my home more biodiverse, because it was this really classically mown park. So all the grass was super short, and there was no flowers and very few small animals, very few insects. And first of all, it just doesn't feel very good to be living next to this kind of death space that gets mown down and killed off every 2 weeks. Just like feels bad to me. But also, like, it's super interesting to see what happens when you then start to say, like, okay, maybe we can make it a bit greener and more biodiverse. You become part of a community conversation. Dog owners are like, wait, what's happening here? Is the grass going to be high? Are my dogs going to get ticks? Or like all these burrs in their fur and stuff. So everybody has their own concerns with the situation changing. And this also makes possible these different kinds of conversations. So the change is kind of happening for me also in the situation where I have all these good intentions about biodiversity, and maybe even a kind of aesthetic now about like the wilderness that a park should have. And other people are stuck kind of in an older perspective on a park, which should be super clean and tidy and mown. And so to be able to, not only garden in your garden, which maybe is a bit of a bourgeois thing to do because it's your own space, you kind of own it, but to step out into something that's a shared space and then start to argue for change, it's really great in the sense that you can feel fulfilled by that. But it's also interestingly challenging in the sense that you bump into all these other people, and you understand that you have to do it with your neighbors who might not all have the same sort of ideological framework as you, or be as up to speed as you. So it's also a challenge again, and to find the shared language, and to find the shared concerns, and to kind of together articulate, a future. I guess then it only becomes a future, like we were talking about Bergson, that the future, it's only there once it becomes concrete, and before that it's just a conversation, I guess. So you have to make it together. And that also makes it less political, right? I think that was my challenge in writing this book, is like, it's not about politics. It's not about the left and the right and all these preset positions, these prefab opinions that we have on a meta level, on a political level, but it's actually more about conversations and finding common ground and shared concerns, but doing so based on this urgency. The point of departure always for this everyday activism is like, things are going really badly, we need to change everywhere, and how can we manage that change together with all these different people who have all these like sometimes great and sometimes very weird ideas? How can we do it together?
It was kind of surprising to me when you said you're going to write a book. I thought, okay, you're probably going to write a book telling people about Extinction Rebellion and why everybody should join Extinction Rebellion and we should all go to the streets and everything. But instead, was that an obvious choice for you? Or because there are some, for instance, Rosemarijn van het Einde, she wrote this really excellent book about explaining why I am an activist and in her case, why as a Christian I am an activist. You could also have written a book like that, but was that obvious for you to write about everyday activism, or did you go through a process first?
First of all, Rosemarijn already wrote this great book, right?
Yeah,
So
and Hannah Prins and Jantijn Adama, and there are many books like that. It's Not That Radical by Michaela Loach.
Yeah. So there's a lot of books already out there. So then, of course, there's the question of what can I add to that? What do I have to say in the first place? And like the first thing, and also how can I make a next step for myself? How can the writing project be something that I actually gather my thoughts in a way that's, productive and moving forward and not just writing down what I already know? And I guess like one of the things that I've really not always, but increasingly as an activist felt is that this whole idea of being an activist is kind of silly because it's this weird way of separating people into categories. As some feminist thinkers would say, this classification. So you're kind of like fixed into this position in society in a certain place, but that also kind of neutralizes you. Now you're an activist. Of course, you're saying that. So before I would start to write a book about why you should join XR, you kind of already know what I'm going to say. So that didn't work for me to say that one more time. And the thing is, I think, like, we enter the climate age now. We enter this quite a long time, at least a couple 100 years, where the climate's not stable because of human actions, and where sort of the basic conditions that we assumed were stable for hundreds of years are shifting quite radically. So we're in this new situation, and I think whatever you do, it's activistic. If you do nothing, it's super activistic. You also hear activists make this argument often, right? Like not changing now is very activistic. Maintaining fossil subsidies is a very activistic thing to do in times of climate collapse. So the idea for the book was to say, like, we all have to adapt. Climate adaptation is something we all need to do. And how can that... And if that's the case, then how does that work? So that was kind of the premise to start writing the book. Also from a wish or a motivation to make this as broad as possible. Peter Kalmus says very pithily, like, we need 1 billion climate activists. And I agree, we need 1 billion, but we don't need 1 billion climate activists in the way we know, we recognize and have come to understand climate activism to be, because I don't think that's realistic. I don't think and if it works, it's great. I would love that to happen. But I think in the meantime, to kind of optimize our opportunities and our possibilities for flourishing and surviving together, we need the intermediate step. We need something that also people who don't have a lot of time or have a lot of other obligations can kind of weave it into their life, Also, if you speak to people of color who do a lot of stuff with anti-racism, you can't really ask them to become also part-time climate activists on the top of that. Many people don't have the energy or the time or the headspace to do that. But maybe for me also, like being an ally, this idea of everyday activism is something you can kind of like weave in and see how it works in things you're doing anyway, stuff you're a part of anyway. You don't have to go to extra meetings. You don't have to take whole days off to sit on the street and get busted around by the cops. It's a bit softer. And I think, we need that broadening now of the scope. That's what we need most. So I think that's the main motivation I had to write it this way, based on this idea, like, we need to adapt anyway. So we might as well do it kind of in a smart and meaningful way, change in a dignified way, and not kind of go kicking and screaming into the new age.
Yeah. I mean, the kicking and screaming is part of it, but it's not the whole thing.
Yeah. We shouldn't rock the kicking and screaming too much, but I think it's part of the process, but it's great if you can come to a point of a certain type of quietude again and self-understanding. And, like at some point in the process, there's also kind of a peacefulness to your position. And that's, I think, because it becomes part of your life, because it becomes something, in a sense, normal and not the exception to the rule, but actually the way we do things. And okay, then your activism is everyday and successful because the everyday has changed. I think that's like the ultimate thing to do.
Nice. Yeah, I'm thinking, because I'm trying to keep these episodes under 1 hour now, which is a challenge. And I have 2 questions, but I'll try to combine them, maybe be more efficient.
It can also be a bit shorter.
Yeah. So, because I cannot not ask you, being in Plato's Cave, you to also talk about Socrates. So I cannot not ask you about that. But I also want to ask you about, the facts and emotions. So where you say that I study disinformation and how to improve resilience against disinformation, and that's a big part of it. But you write as well that so without the facts, proportional seems radical. So actually what's proportional seems radical if you think that climate change isn't a crisis.
Yeah, exactly.
But you also write that, it's the facts. The facts are not sufficient, because if they were, I mean, the systems would have changed already.
Exactly. So, I mean,
2 questions: Socrates and feelings.
Yeah, I'll try to end on Socrates. That's a nice kind of anecdotal thing. But like the first part, like significant part of the book is devoted to this encounter of facts and emotions, right? That's like my main insight as a child of psychologists and now like a 5-year activist, is that it is about the emotions. And then the book was called Everyday Activism, and that's also a reference to Everyday Racism from Philomena Asset from 1984, where she kind of described the everyday dimension of racism, all these kind of small things that go on between people. And she, in 84, said, like, we've shown that it's not information that's the problem with racism. If you give people more information, they don't necessarily become less racist, right? It's not a rational, purely cognitive issue we're facing. And it's the same with the climate crisis. And when the soup was thrown against the paintings, for me, this was the best like capsule summary of that question, that it's about what we are considerate with, what we feel connected to. And so the facts need to be given a place kind of in our bodies and in our lives and in our sense of the world, which is a very subjective, emotional space. And that's not something that's per se easy to do or something that's overnight, but it can happen quite quickly. So like with the book, the first part of the book, I try to kind of give sort of a speed dating with this between the facts and the emotions kind of for the reader to kind of like be able to reflect in themselves on this relationship, because there's so many automations going on, right? In sort of like, bad news, and you kind of don't even think about what you do with it. You just kind of like whip and it leaves, and you're kind of happy that you survived the bad climate news again. So being able to internalize that without like going totally off the rails or becoming super depressed, so with care, is very, very important. And it should be something for whole society now, this kind of group climate therapy that we all need to deal with this kind of catastrophic reality is a really big thing. So I hope a lot of books get written about that, and a lot of conversations and shows kind of get devoted to this process. We need to go through quite a lot together. It's like we all have this like really, really bad medical diagnosis, like as a world society. So we need to deal with that. And then how do we deal with that? Well, I guess Socrates like kind of can be a mascot for us, right? Because he spoke these uncomfortable truths to his society. He asked these questions that people didn't want to consider, kind of showed the back end of a lot of things that were positive self-images in society, and he kind of critiqued or questioned the assumptions behind those. And then Michel Foucault, this 20th century philosopher, talks a lot about this. That was called paresia. So it's this particular way of speaking a truth, of being a truth teller in a society, but not in a way that like, especially in the Netherlands, this conversation has been going on in the past 20 years with this kind of far right movement where freedom of expression, you're allowed and entitled to say everything you like. But for this ancient Greek figure of the truth teller, it's not like it's an entitlement or you can say whatever the hell you like. It's kind of a responsibility to society to say uncomfortable things, even though you know that people won't really like you more for it. So you have to take a risk to be honest about these uncomfortable truths. And I think in this meeting of facts and emotions, that's super important role for people to take. It's a form of climate leadership to be able to put your risk at risk, the fun meeting or the nice Christmas dinner, without being entitled or kind of an asshole about it, but actually being very out of a sense of care to your community. You're doing something uncomfortable and maybe painful and broaching a subject that hasn't been talked about. And so this paresia, look, Socrates at some point was so kind of hated for doing this that they sentenced him to death, and he had to drink a hemlock potion, a poison. And he accepted that as his role. So I don't propose that people take it this far, but yeah, he's a kind of an archetype for a certain type of honest speech that I think is, for me, it's the heart of climate leadership today.
Being the neighborhood Socrates, not the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, but the friendly neighborhood Socrates.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lovely image. Maybe like, you don't need to wear the toga, but you can ask the questions like, do we really need to mow the lawn? Do we really need to take the plane? Isn't there better things we can be doing together with our space and our capacities and our love and our intelligence than a lot of the stuff we're doing today?
Well, thank you so much. And I really hope the book will be translated to English as well.
Thanks a lot for having me again, Maya. It was a pleasure.
Everything we see and seem is but a dream within a dream.